Hello and Testale everyone, welcome to class 12 biology. In our previous video we discussed about the origin of life, that is how life first appeared on earth, and then we discussed about the evolution of life, that is how life diversified. And in order to explain the evolution of life, we discussed about the Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, in which he said that the evolution of life forms is driven by evolutionary forces such as natural selection. Right. And the main ideas behind this particular theory is that species, they change over time. There has been extinctions in the past as well as there has been speciation. By speciation we mean appearance of new species, right? And different species, they share common ancestors. So these are the main ideas behind his theory of evolution by natural selection. Right, he said that the changes that occur in a species, right, which can give rise to a new species or which can lead to extinction of some species, they are all driven by evolutionary forces such as natural selection. Now, when we say the word theory, right, in non-scientific terms, it may have got different connotations, right? But in scientific terms, a theory is not some unsubstantiated idea, right? When a scientist, they propose a theory, when a scientist proposes a theory, that theory has to be based upon strong evidences, right? So that the theory does not falter upon scrutinization by other scientists. So what are the evidences available for evolution? So this is what we are going to discuss in this particular video, right? How can we confidently say that evolution has occurred on Earth, right? What are the evidences that we have which supports that evolution has occurred on Earth, right? So we have a list of these evidences over here. The first one is paleontological evidence, second is embryological evidence, third is morphological and anatomical evidence, fourth is biochemical evidence, fifth is artificial selection as evidence for evolution, sixth is examples of natural selection as evidences for evolution. So these are the evidences that are provided in your textbook for supporting evolution, right? So we will discuss them one by one. The first evidence is paleontological evidence. Paleontology is the branch of science which deals with the study of fossils of plants and animals. So what are fossils? Fossils are the remains of hard parts of life forms like plants and animals that are found in rocks. So just like this one, the hard part of the animal, that is the bones that are found in the rocks, they are called as fossils. But before we discuss about how fossils act as evidence for evolution, let us first look at the fossilization process. So in the fossilization process, let us say an animal long time back, it died, and it died in such a way that it was not eaten by the scavengers and its whole body got buried under the soil. And after a long period of time, due to the sedimentation process, the body got buried deeper and deeper underneath the layer of soil, and the hard part of the animal, that is the bones, it got preserved in the sedimentary rocks. Right. So the bones, they got preserved in the sedimentary rocks, and that is called as fossilization. So the bones are said to be now fossilized. And during certain point of time, due to some geological processes like soil erosion or tectonic plate movement, the fossil, it starts to appear near the surface of the earth. And that is when the scientists or paleontologists, they find those fossils. So that is about the fossilization process. Now let us see how fossils act as evidence for evolution. A study of fossils in different sedimentary layers indicates the geological period in which they existed. So what does it mean? If you take the cross-section of Earth's crust, you will find different sedimentary layers. These sedimentary layers are of different age. It is in such a way that the older sedimentary layers are much deeper below the surface, whereas the most recent sedimentary layers, the sedimentary rocks, they are found near the surface. And the fossils that are present in these sedimentary layers of different ages, they tell us what life or what life forms were present during that particular time in the geological period. So if we take an example of the Cambrian period, which is about 542 million years ago, if you want to find out what life forms were present during the Cambrian period, what you have to do is you have to take a look at the sedimentary layer which was formed 542 million years ago, and then you have to try to find out the fossils that are preserved in those rocks, right? And the fossils will tell you what life forms were present during the Cambrian period. So that is how a study of fossils in different sedimentary layers indicates the geological time period in which those life forms existed, right? Not only that, the fossils also tell us the life forms, they have varied over time, and certain life forms are restricted to certain geological time spans. It means that life forms, they have gradually changed over time, right? They have changed over time. And if you take a look over here during the Jurassic period, that is 199 million years to 145 million years ago, right? That is called as the Jurassic period. During that period, what forms of life were present, and was it found during the period after that, or was it found the period before that? If you take a look, you find that these large dinosaurs, like the meat-eating dinosaurs, right, they were present only during the Jurassic period. So that shows that certain life forms are restricted to certain geological time spans, right, and they have gone extinct, right? Hence, new forms of life have arisen at different times in the history of Earth, right? So after the extinction of dinosaurs, new forms of life, they have arisen, right? So different kinds of mammals, they have arisen. So the fossils, they act as evidence for the evolution of life. Fossils tells us that evolution of life has occurred, right? So the paleontological evidence is the first evidence for evolution. The second evidence for evolution is embryological evidence. It was proposed by Ernst Haeckel in his theory Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which means that the embryonic developmental stages of a particular animal, it goes through the same phases as its evolutionary phase. Right? If we take an example of the embryological development of the vertebrates, in the early embryos of all these vertebrates, we can see that they have pharyngeal gill slits present behind their heads, right? But the functional gills are present only in the adults of the fishes. And he said that since the gill slits appear in all the embryos of all these vertebrates, he said that these vertebrates, they share a common ancestor which was like a fish, right, which looked like a fish. So if we take an example of the human beings, we also had an ancestor which was fish-like, and it is proved by the presence of gill slits in our early embryos, right? And not just gill slits, we also have tails, right? We also have tail, right? So these tail, they may not be present in the adult form, adult life form, but the presence of the tail in the embryonic stage, it represents the presence of a phase in our evolutionary history, right, in which our ancestor had a functional tail, right? So that is the embryological evidence proposed by Ernst Haeckel, and his theory goes ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. But later on, scientists like Carl von Baer, he disapproved the theory proposed by Ernst Haeckel, saying that these embryonic stages, it never passes through the life stages of other adult animals like insects or other invertebrates, right? So the theory proposed by Ernst Haeckel was disapproved later on by Carl von Baer. Even though the theory proposed by Ernst Haeckel, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, was disapproved by Carl von Baer, Charles Darwin, in his book The Origin of Species, he used comparative embryology as an evidence for evolution. So that is about the second evidence, that is embryological evidence for evolution. Morphological and anatomical evidences are the third evidence for evolution. So in this one, morphological and anatomical similarities among organisms can be interpreted to understand regarding their shared ancestry. If there are different animals and they have got certain morphological or anatomical similarities among themselves, then we can assume, or we can interpret that they have got common ancestors, right? And in this one we have to study about two structures, right? Homologous structures and analogous structures. So homologous structures are those structures in different organisms which perform different functions but have similar anatomical structures. The example given in your textbook is the forelimbs of whales, bats, cheetah and humans. So forelimb means our hand, right? So forelimbs of these animals, they are all homologous structures. Now these are considered as homologous structures because if you look at the forelimbs of these animals, different animals, right, even though they look different, they function different, their anatomical structures are same. They all have humerus, radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals and phalanges in their forelimbs. So these are nothing but the bones that are present in our forelimb, right? Humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, the wrist bones, metacarpals means our palm bones, and then phalanges, the digit bones, right? So all these bones are present in all these structures, right? So these structures are called as homologous structures. So homologous structure definition is very important. The structure in different organisms which perform different functions but have similar anatomical structures. So over here, these animals, they use their forelimbs for different purpose, right? For humans, we use it for grabbing. For cats, they use for running or scratching. Whales, they use for swimming. Bats, they use for flying, right? So they have got different functions. They perform different functions, but they have got same internal anatomical structure. Right, now the same structure, right, they developed along different directions in different animals due to adaptations to different needs. Now we say that these homologous structures, they show common ancestry, right? So all these animals, they had got common ancestor, right, with the forelimb. But these animals, being since they live in different environment, right, and they need to adapt in a different environment, therefore their structure developed along different directions. This is called as divergent evolution. So homology is based on divergent evolution, right? So other examples are the hearts of vertebrates and the brains of vertebrates. And examples in plants are the thorns of bougainvillea and tendrils of cucurbita. So thorns of bougainvillea and tendrils of cucurbita, they are homologous structures, right? One, it is used for defense purpose, whereas tendrils, it is used for climbing purpose, but the anatomical structure is similar. Okay, so that is about the homologous structures. The second one is the analogous structures. This is completely different from the homologous structures. So analogous structures are those structures in different organisms which perform similar functions but have different anatomical structures. So you have to remember the definition of homologous structures and analogous structures. You don't confuse between the two. Analogous structures, structures in different organisms which perform similar functions but have different anatomical structures. Right. So examples include wings of butterfly and wings of birds. Right. So these structures are said to be analogous structures. They are not anatomically similar. They have got different anatomical structures. For example, it contains bones, right? The bird wings contain bones, whereas the butterfly wings, they don't contain bones. But they perform similar function, that is flying, right? So analogous structures are result of convergent evolution. Right? There's something is converging, right? So different structures, right, they evolve, right, for the same function, that is for flying, and hence they have got similarity. From outside, the wings, they may look similar. Why? Because these structures, even though they are anatomically different, they have evolved in such a way that they perform similar function, right? So that is about the analogous structure. So other examples of analogy is the eye of the octopus and of the mammals, right? The eye of the octopus and mammals, they both perform the same thing, sensation to the lights, right? But they are all they have all arisen from different anatomical structures, right? And then there we have examples of flippers of penguins and dolphins, right? Flippers of penguins and dolphins. A penguin is like a bird, right? Dolphins, they are mammals. So the flippers, they are different, but they perform same function, that is for swimming. And then we have got sweet potato and potato. Sweet potato, it is from modification of roots, whereas potato is modification of stem, right? They both perform the same function, that is the storage of food materials for the plants, right? So that is about the analogous structure. So the third evidence, that is the morphological and anatomical evidence for evolution, you have to study about homologous structures and analogous structures. The fourth evidence is biochemical evidence. In biochemical evidence, we look at the similarities in proteins and genes performing a given function among diverse organisms. Right? If there are similarities in proteins and genes among different organisms, this can also indicate common ancestry. Right? Now, to simplify the things over here, if you take a look over here, hippopotamus and whales, the largest mammal on the planet Earth, that is whales and hippopotamus, they are said to share a common ancestor. Now, if you look at the whale, it lives in sea, whereas hippopotamus, it lives on African grassland as well as in the rivers of Africa. They don't have any structural similarities, right? They don't appear to have any structural similarities, but the scientists, they found out by comparing the genome of the organisms, they found out that the closest animal that the whales are related to are the hippopotamus, right? By comparing the genome of these two organisms, they found out that these two are related in such a way that they share a common ancestor which lived about 54 million years ago. Right? By looking from outside, we cannot say that these two are related. We cannot think that these two are related, but by comparing their biochemicals, like genes, when they compared the genes, DNA of these two organisms, they found out that these two organisms are evolutionarily related to each other. Right? In fact, they are more related to each other than any other mammals. Right? So that is the biochemical evidence. That is the similarities in biochemicals like proteins and genes that can indicate common ancestry. Artificial selection is the fifth evidence for evolution. So what do we mean by artificial selection? Right? Human beings, throughout the history, we have been performing selective breeding of plants and animals for our own needs, like for agriculture, for sports, for security, right? So the selective breeding process is nothing but artificial selection in action, right? We are the ones who are selecting different varieties of plants and animals. For example, we take rice plants. Human beings, they need rice plants which yield more rice, right? Which yields more rice. So we select only those varieties of rice plants which gives us more yield. So we are the ones which are selecting the rice plants which are giving more yield. So therefore it is called as artificial selection. So the process of artificial selection includes selective breeding of plants and animals. Another example that we can take is our human's best friend, that is dogs. Now dogs, we have got different breeds of dogs nowadays, from small chihuahuas to large Doberman or German shepherds, right? But they are all related to each other, that they have all evolved from a common ancestor which looked like a wolf, and that wolf, it stayed near the humans during prehistoric times, right? So human beings, they domesticated those wolves, and then they selectively bred those wolves according to their own needs, right? According to their own fancy, right? And thereby created this many types of dogs. Now, the argument of artificial selection, such artificial selection as evidence for evolution, is that if within few hundred years, if human beings could create new breeds just like these dogs, right, could not nature have done the same thing over millions of years? Nature had millions of years at its disposal, right? And if human beings can create this many breeds in few hundred years, nature could have done the same thing in millions of years, right? So that artificial selection, it acts as evidence for evolution because of this particular argument. Okay, so artificial selection is the fifth evidence for evolution. In our list of evidences for evolution, examples of natural selection as evidences for evolution is the sixth and the final one. If you remember, Charles Darwin proposed a theory of evolution, evolution by natural selection, in which he said that natural selection is the driving force behind evolutionary process. If we find examples of natural selection in example, we can use those examples as evidences in support for evolution. One such example is industrial melanism. So industrial melanism was observed in England. In order to understand industrial melanism, we have to look at two different time frames. One before Industrial Revolution and two after Industrial Revolution. So before Industrial Revolution in 1850s, scientists, they carried out population studies on a typical moth species known as peppered moths. So in peppered moths there were two varieties. One was a typical form which was lighter colored, whereas the second variety was a melanic dark one, a dark melanic form. So these are both same species but of different color variations. Now in 1850s, that is before Industrial Revolution, when population studies were made, the scientists, they found out that the lighter typical form of moth was more in number compared to the darker melanic form. But after Industrial Revolution, that is in 1920s, when the same population study was repeated, they found that the darker melanic form were more in number compared to the typical lighter form. Now why is that? So the explanation they gave for that was the tree trunks on which the moths lived before Industrial Revolution, it was covered with lichens. The tree trunks were covered with lichens, and in this particular case, the lighter moth were inconspicuous compared to the darker moth, right? And if there is a predator, for the eyes of the predator, the darker moth was more conspicuous and it can be easily picked off. So therefore, the population of the white or the lighter colored moth, the typical form of the moth, was more compared to the darker melanic form. That is before Industrial Revolution. But after Industrial Revolution, due to air pollution, since lichens were more sensitive, very sensitive to air pollution, all the lichens that were growing on the tree trunks, they died. When the lichens died, the tree trunks were left bare, and due to the nearby smoke and soot of the industries, the trunk or the bark of the trees, they became dark in color. Right, the soots, they settled down on the tree trunks and the tree trunks became dark in color, and this changed the situation in such a way that now the lighter typical form of the moth, they were now more conspicuous to the eyes of the birds or the predators compared to the darker melanic form, and thereby they were easily picked off by the birds, and therefore the white or the lighter typical form of the moth population, it gradually reduced, and the darker melanic form, it started to increase in number, right? So that changed in population dynamics were the result of natural selection in action. Here the natural selection pressure was predator, right? So that is one example, and it shows that evolution in fact occurs. And if you want to know one extra information, in 1973 in England, when the population slowly declined, right? Not population, the pollution, when the pollution slightly declined, what happened was the lighter colored moth, the population, it started to increase, right? Because the lichens, they started to grow back, and now the advantage that the lighter colored moth had, it got the advantage back, and therefore the population dynamic again, it changed in 1973, right? So that is natural selection in action. So this particular example is really important. You have this diagram given in a textbook. What I want you to do is I want you to practice drawing this diagram, because from examination perspective, this particular example of natural selection is very important. So if you are asked to provide an example of natural selection in support of evolutionary process, then you have to give this industrial melanism as an example, and you have to draw this diagram in support of your answer, right? So that is one thing. Other examples of natural selection in action are selection of resistant varieties of herbs and pests, and then there is another example, selection of antibiotic resistant microbes, right? So such selections, they occur because when human beings, we spray herbicides and pesticides, what happens is the more resistant varieties, they get to grow more in number. The population of the resistant varieties of the herbs and pests, right, they grow more in number, whereas the less resistant varieties, they die off, right? So this one happens in nature, right? Also, if you take antibiotics, if you use antibiotics, what happens is the use of antibiotic leads to development of more resistant forms of microbes, more resistant forms of bacteria, right? So those bacteria which are less resistant, they will die off, and instead of that, the population of the resistant microbes or the resistant bacteria, they will increase. So that is also example of natural selection in action. So these are the examples provided in your textbook, right? So now we have discussed all the evidences available for evolution that is provided in your textbook. In the next video, we will discuss about the adaptive radiation. Okay, so please read about adaptive radiation, and then you can watch the next video. Thank you.